Chris Adamski of Trib Lives was on the #1 Cochran Sports Showdown last night and said this, talking about a Pittsburgh Steelers future, or the Pittsburgh Steelers future, with George Pickens. Quote, "I think there's a chance that a team like the Raiders actually make a lot of sense, comes in and just makes an offer the Steelers can't refuse, or it gets leaked out there in the spring and people start calling. Is George available? Just put that flyer out there and see if those teams make them a high draft pick offer that you almost have to take." I got two questions with this one, okay? Because I think the Steelers would consider an offer for George. I don't think that they wouldn't. I think the Steelers would consider an offer for most players not named TJ Watt or Cam Hayward. I mean, why wouldn't you? Why would you look at it and say, George is entering a contract year. He's going to want a lot of money. You're probably going to have to pay him a lot of money. And maybe you could get a pretty good draft pick for a guy that is only 23, going to be 24 years old, and has a pretty bright future instead of having to pay somebody. And then you could replace him with a cheaper option like T. Higgins. What's the baseline for you of a price tag that you do trade George Pickens away for? And is it a realistic price tag where you think a team could call and make that offer for George Pickens?
We've seen some pretty hefty wide receiver trades over the last couple of years, but the problem is so many teams are making these younger wide receivers work. Whereas if they need a number one and they don't have a number one, it's just as likely that you find it in the draft as you are to find it in a trade market or find it on the free agent market. So I think for that reason, you're going to see a price tag probably be a little bit lower than everybody wants. But if I'm the Steelers, I look around and I say, yeah, we wanted Roman Wilson to potentially emerge as a number two, but we don't know. We have no answers to that question. And the only option we have right now is George Pickens and maybe somebody that we draft. So I think with that in mind, you're looking at nothing shorter of a second round pick, but I think you're hoping for offer you can't refuse territory. That has to be a first, and certainly a first that's within the top 15, top 16 of the first round.
What is the likelihood the Steelers would actually get that?
I think it's unlikely, because I think somebody in that round is just going to look at it and say, well, I mean, we could just draft a wide receiver in the top 16 and he'll be young like Pickens is, and he will be less used than George Pickens is, and he will probably have less off the field issues on record as George Pickens. And again, I'm not saying that's something that would be the biggest indicator or the biggest reasoning, but I think it definitely plays into the conversations, especially.
I agree and disagree, because I think that the luxury of the George Pickens situation with the Pittsburgh Steelers is that other teams are almost always ignore the issues. You know, they almost always are like, nah, they're not that big, you know, or over here, we could keep them calm. It's not that big of a deal. We'll be okay. That seems to happen across the board, especially teams that are willing to make splash offers for big, crazy players. You know, the Steelers don't make those big, splashy, crazy offers. Why? Because they're not looking to take on somebody who the team doesn't want for whatever reason. Teams like the Raiders, teams like the Jets, the Titans, the Bears, all those crazy teams, excuse me, that will make those big, crazy offers, they almost always ignore the situation. Antonio Brown for a third round pick, you know, like Antonio Brown was worth a lot, but I don't think he was worth anything at the same time. Why? Because he was throwing stuff off balconies and causing all sorts of issues and not showing up in week 17 when the Steelers needed him to show up in week 17. But the Raiders make the trade, and they're willing to give up a big compensation on that market, because the wide receiver market at that time, you know, Martavis Bryant, another great example where teams are almost always willing to give more and ignore the issues. And it almost always comes back to bite them in the butt, but they all, you know, they do make those mistakes. I agree with you on the first round pick. I think, you know, you get a first round pick for George Pickens, you trade George Pickens, depending on where in that first round it is. But you could fill a need and replace George Pickens with a first round pick. And you don't even have to draft somebody. You can go, because that's, if you're not going to pay George, go pay a guy like T. Higgins. Go get Christian Kirk. Go make those splash offers and sign those guys, and then have 2 first-round picks where you could fill other needs, corner and defensive tackle. Go get a running back if a running back is available. Go add to your offensive line if you need to. There are options, and I think the wide receiver market is going to be, maybe you're not going to walk away with a George Pickens and a T. Higgins if you get rid of George, but you might walk away with a T. Higgins and somebody who is better than what you have right now as a good number 2 and feel okay about the situation. I do think that's a possibility. I think a lot of it is going to come down to, what does the contract negotiation look like between George and the Pittsburgh Steelers? How does that affect things? How quickly does it turn south or sour? How fast is he willing to not show up to OTAs and minicamp and possibly training camp? What does that progression look like? How bad does it get that fast? Because anybody sitting around saying the Pittsburgh Steelers are going to come out here and an offer is going to be made and it's just going to be a smooth negotiation, it's not. TJ Watt had to walk into Art Rooney's office, slam his fist down, and say, "We're taking the deal because I just want to play football." Mm-hmm. It took Minkah Fitzpatrick much shorter than anybody else, but still right before training camp to get a deal done. The Steelers are not going to walk in here and say, "Here's your $30 million, George. Have fun. We're thankful to have you." It's going to be slow, and it's going to work in a way where there is going to be actual negotiations. When those actual negotiations happen, how does George respond to low ball numbers? How does his agent respond to low ball numbers? That will indicate what comes next between the Pittsburgh Steelers and George Pickens. I will say this: the Steelers' first option, their top priority, will be to keep George. Like, we could talk trades all day long. The Steelers' top priority will be to keep George long-term and sign him to a deal. That will be how that goes. But what happens between the first contract offer and the last, that's totally up for debate and something we will have no idea what happens until it actually starts to happen. And that's when these hypotheticals, like Adamski tosses in here, could actually go down to the point where the Pittsburgh Steelers might say, "All right, let's just see what the price tag is for George Pickens, and let's just see if we could send him somewhere who would be very open to a wide receiver." And what helps that situation, I'll end with this: there aren't enough quarterbacks in this draft to say we're staying put for a quarterback. There's 2 first-round quarterbacks that are locks. Everybody else is fringe first-round quarterback, possibly a second-round quarterback. It's not a very deep quarterback draft. And because of that, you're going to get a lot of teams that are sitting there going, why would we sit here and not trade this pick away so that we draft what? A tackle or a defensive lineman or a linebacker or a corner? No, let's go get George Pickens. He's a proven commodity. He's a star. Let's go get him, because that's going to help our quarterback of the future whenever we do get a quarterback of the future, because it won't be in this year's draft. I think that does certainly help the Steelers' favor. But again, top priority will be to sign George Pickens in the offseason. Will it happen? I don't know. You gotta. What's your likelihood the Steelers sign George Pickens compared to trading him?
I would think it's more than likely that they end up signing Pickens. I mean, they see the talent and the value that he has there. And while, yes, you can make the argument that you trade up, you get an earlier draft pick, and maybe you end up with, T. Higgins and Tedorota McMillan out of Arizona State. Yeah, that's great. Or Arizona, I can't remember which one he goes to, but that's great. Or you could have George Pickens wait a little bit, and if you want that wide receiver, and if you're desperate for that other wide receiver, you just get a Emeka Egbuka a little bit later on. I mean, either way, you're in a much better position than you are now. But I think George Pickens is younger. He has less of an injury history, and I think the Steelers are going to like the guy that they already have in the building and know what he is and know what he can be, and they're going to stick with him.
I agree. If I had to put my odds on this, George Pickens remains in Pittsburgh, a deal that is roughly $30 million a year, which you could agree or disagree with that number. But I would say that's where the Pittsburgh Steelers offense and wide receiver situation is headed.